Exotic Research Conference in Mesa, Arizona. This morning, our sessions are all going to be revolving around anti-gravity concepts and their realities. Our first speaker this morning, Tom Valone, is an author of 2 books and numerous papers on energy and propulsion. He is a physicist, retired college professor, and president of Integrity Research Institute, a nonprofit corporation that recently presented the first conference on future energy in Washington, D.C. Speaking on Electrogravitics, a 21st century propulsion. Please welcome Mr. Tom Valone.
Morning, thank you. What I'm going to do is give you a nice overview of several different electrogravitic systems. And the first slide, if you can't see or read the slides, feel free to move up. That's as big as the image can get, so I apologize for that. The first point that we're going to make about electrogravitic systems is that this is a copy of the 1956 report that talks about an examination of electrostatic motion, dynamic counterbury, and barycentric control. And of course, those were code words back then, talking about some pressure-related high voltage terminology. The important point for you, though, is that this is the discovery of Thomas Townsend Brown. And T. Townsend Brown is famous for, first of all, inventing an electrostatic motor, which he patented in the 30s, and then proceeded to research the possibility of using electrostatic voltage, high voltage, above 20 or 30 kV to actually cause motion. And what we found, actually crediting Dr. Paul LaViolette for doing this, is researching the topic electrogravitic systems. There were no copies available anywhere in the country through interlibrary loan except at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And this is the actual Xerox copy of the inside cover, which you just saw the title of enlarged. And it was published by the Gravity RAND group in London, and this is the Wright-Patterson logo, the technical library. In fact, even at the library itself, it wasn't even on the card catalog. The librarian had to go to the shelves to find it. So it was interesting that this was a difficult publication to recover. It has been on the internet. There's a copy of it on the internet presently. But the interesting thing is this is the only surviving historical document that seems to indicate this was a widespread research project in the 50s. It's based on, this is a diagram from Townsend Brown's notes describing the fact that he would charge the upper surface of a disk object positively and then the underside negatively, and put a little thread and a counterweight and then see what happens when he would apply voltage to that. Of course, there was exhibiting a small force upwards. Townsend Brown did have an interest in UFOs. That's perhaps why the disc-shaped design was carried through his research. In fact, as I understand, he formed NICAP years ago, which still survives to this day. This is a copy of his later 1960 patent, which shows the disc-shaped objects that are suspended by a turnstile. And we also have it demonstrated up here due to Larry Davenport's efforts at reproducing this. Now, I should point out that all of his later patents of 1960 and afterwards were, we feel, reproductions of what he did through the 1950s. Now, he demonstrated the device we just showed before the Naval Research Lab. And that was what started the Project Winter Haven. In fact, this particular demonstration device was about 6 feet in diameter. The discs were fairly large. It was able to demonstrate a fairly good RPM and therefore what was proposed to be a pretty good miles per hour projection. And so the Navy took this on as a project As you see in this cover of a silent videotape, 1958 to 1960 is when he finally started to do private research. But our conjecture is that through the 54 to 56 or so, 57, those couple years are when the military decided to commercialize it, or at least get the aviation industry interested. Sperry Rand and all the other Bell systems that were involved at that time in aviation studies. Their goal in the report, which this was an order form called Aviation Studies International, their goal was to produce a Mach 3 saucer. And they specifically described the benefits of having such a fighter. I can't really read the slide to be able to. The important report summary, which I've come up with 7 points to validate the information that we see in the report, is that the Brown's experiments are documented. We see that it lists the major aerospace corporations that were being invited to be involved in the research. It included the voltage and power requirements for supersonic speed, and it detailed even the dielectric constant for a Mach 3 fighter. Now this is an interesting point, because back in the 50s, the dielectrics that were available were not able to achieve, say, a constant dielectric constant of 5,000 or higher. And only to this day, only presently, are we able to achieve that type of material to withstand the charge displacement. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a minute. The other point that this report shows is a continuity from Project Winter Haven. It refers to the project, and it also shows the projected avenue of research. And it listed virtually every electrostatic patent that was available at the time. So it was very clear that electrostatics were part of this process. And lastly, the report itself was classified by the US Air Force for a time. In fact, on the cover, you can actually see where they blacked out the word confidential, the word classified, rather. This is the cover of my book. The present edition actually has the diagram illustrated in reverse print, but I felt it important enough to put it into a bound copy so it would be available publicly, and we actually had it ready for the 1994 symposium on Townsend Brown that was in Philadelphia. The reason I decided to publish it was that Dr. Paula Violette also released a report approximately around 1994 of the U.S. Anti-Gravity Squadron. That was the title of his presentation to the Tesla Society, and he goes into detail about the design of the B-2 bomber. And what's interesting is that the recommendations from Townsend Brown specifically match many of the design criteria for the B-2. The B-2, as you may know, has a wingspan as wide as the B-52. It's huge. And what's interesting is that it avails itself of a very wide and very long front edge. Leading edge is very when you consider how much exposure there is, and also the width compared to the jet stream coming out the back. Now, the charging of the leading edge has two benefits. One, of course, we believe is that it's related to the electrogravitics effect, but secondly, it also seems to soften the shock wave. So the supersonic travel is possible, and actually with less resistance. The negatively charging of the exhaust gas also seems to have dual effect. First of all, it's opposite charge to the leading edge and seems to be related to the electrogravitics. But secondly, it also seems to, and this is right in the Aviation Weekly report, which has been made public now, is that it absorbs the heat content of the exiting gases. So much so that there's an 800 times reduction in the temperature of the thermal signature. So this is very important for the B2 to be able not to be detected thermally. And this is Dr. LaViolette's diagram of the charge displacement as the B2 is going to the left. You get a front leading edge, which is forward and back, forward and above and below, as well as to the side. In other words, creating a large shield of positive charges. And the trailing edge also counter charges that, so that the G-force, as he has proposed through his book on subquantum kinetics, actually has a very large area to activate and work on. That's the interesting thing, is that it appears that this is an auxiliary power system that can be activated when the B2 is up to a certain speed. It also is very efficient. It seems to maybe explain how the B2 was able to get to Europe and back without refueling during the recent Yugoslavian conflict. And this is one of, when you picture the basic design, which is reproducing some of Townsend Brown's experiments, simply suspending a capacitor with a dielectric essentially causes a force toward the positive. And Dr. LaViolette's description of it is that there's a G hill created at the negative charging side, and then a G well, it's like going downhill, in other words, where the positive charge is. So that's a simplistic analogy to explain it. And of course, this is the apparatus that was recently designed by Larry Davenport. He found that the reason many of the experiments had failed, including some Air Force sponsored, like Talley's report and Craven's, some of them reported negative results of trying to reproduce this. And here Larry Davenport, in his own garage in Texas, finds that he can do it very easily. He used miniature race car bearings at the surface there for the turnstile, and drastically reduced the friction involved. Now, electrogravitics or electrogravity, using high voltage to have gravitational effect, also is related to the Searle effect. I've had a great interest in Searle for 20 years, since I met him in 1980, and ever since then I've corresponded with him. These are some of the letters and correspondence that he sent. John Searle is a living legend. Many people have various opinions of his research and his accomplishments. The levity disk that he called his saucers were based on his encounter years ago, which I've met now 3 inventors, including him, who have had UFO experiences, lost time, and then all of a sudden they had like inspirations, dreams or imagination. They needed to build something afterwards. And John Searle is one of them. He didn't even understand what he was trying to build. But the fact is, he got very busy shortly after that. This is one of the balsa wood type of constructions that he made. His dream, of course, was to have one big enough that he could actually travel around in. But he did build small ones that were able to be powered remotely. And the way he did it was very similar to the Brown electrogravitics, charging one side a little bit more negatively than the other. With the charge imbalance, he found he could actually steer the device. Without going into too much detail about the saucer design, the important thing is that the distribution of charge on the surface and the use of charge to steer it corresponds and basically matches the same principles that the Townsend Brown electrogravitics is based on. And he actually got some press coverage back in Britain years ago. There's a book called The Anti-Gravity, The Dream Made Reality by John Thomas that tells his life story. And as you can imagine, an inventor that's ahead of his time does face a lot of resistance. The electric propulsion study by Dr. Dennis Cravens, which is available from the DTIC, can actually be a good reference, because the Air Force Astronautics Laboratory produced this and includes an evaluation of Townsend Brown's research. This was done in September 1989. The NTIS number is ADA 227121, case anyone's interested. The audio track there to obtain a copy. And you probably can't read this, but the important thing about it is there's a table that evaluates the rating of the various non-conventional or emerging technology propulsion devices. And ElectroGravitics got a pretty good rating in terms of power, practicality, and so forth. So I was very pleased when I read that. And of course, what we're talking about is gravity. Gravity is very important. In fact, so important that NASA has been quoted. Actually, a researcher at NASA says, "The way I see it, NASA has a responsibility to overcome gravity. We've been building anti-gravity machines since day one. It's just they're not as efficient as we'd like them to be." And there is the breakthrough physics propulsion workshop that is actually held every year now for a couple of years. Dr. Mark Millis is the director of that. And I am happy to see that type of research being promoted by NASA, and I feel that there's great hope, especially when more cooperation from different parts of government are actually included. But of course, we all know that gravity is not just a good idea, it's a law. And unfortunately, we've been treating it that way ever since Newton decided to convince us that gravity was the ultimate. But the important thing is that it's the weakest force in nature. And to imagine that Faraday, for example, speculated back in 1831 that gravity could be influenced by electromagnetic fields. Einstein also verified that and convinced us. We simply have had publications like this that speculate that practical anti-gravity is still far off. Dr. Robert Forward, who's the author of this paper, which was in a physics journal, has actually contributed to the research in anti-gravity and proposed some of the understandings of how to use zero-point energy, store it, and even design various anti-gravity devices. Now, one of the interesting sidelines to this effect of gravity or using gravity is back when the fifth force was talked about. This is based on an experiment with aluminum and iron falling simultaneously, being released simultaneously, and the claim was the aluminum seemed to have a little bit faster travel and a little bit less time to traverse the entire distance. And this was done in a vacuum, and so the speculation was that there was this anti-gravity force or a fifth force that could be responsible. And some of the publications, including Science News, talked about clues to the fifth force and its source. So I was very excited about that because it's the first time, this was about 10 years ago or more, when anti-gravity was starting to become a household scientific word. And of course the question is whether anti-gravity can be talked about publicly, especially in scientific circles, because I received a lot of bad press when I tried to have a conference on future energy a couple months ago, and of course included concepts like anti-gravity and free energy and things, of course, that deserve a lot of criticism. But I think this is something that after 20 years of attending conferences, we should start examining, especially when you consider the pollution that we're causing by our jets and our coal-burning generators for electricity. Now, NASA seems to agree because the solar eclipse that's now scheduled for, I think, August 11th will, for the first time, include a test of Dr. Elias's research that, in this particular article, challenge us to consider whether the laws of gravitation should be reconsidered. The research that he did, and this is based on Erwin Saxel's work as well, was that back in 1970, a solar eclipse was seen by a torsion pendulum. And this was published in the Physical Review B back then. And what's interesting is that these two gentlemen didn't really know each other at the time they were doing the research. Dr. Saxel worked in I think it was the MIT area, and Dr. Elias was over in France. And yet both of them used different types of pendula, and they both experienced anomalies during solar eclipse. So since Elias finally received the Nobel Prize, decades later, NASA decides, well, maybe we should look into this. So they're going to use a different type of gravity sensor, which is very sensitive, extremely sensitive, when I read about it. And apparently they do know about Saxel's work as well. The nice thing is that back when I was attending a conference in Massachusetts, I was fortunate enough to meet the co-author of all of Saxel's papers, and that was Mildred Allen. Saxel had passed away prior to 1980, and I was pleased to get from Mildred Allen an unpublished manuscript that was the observations of periodic phenomena with a massive torsion pendulum. And this particular publication is available in the bookstore, and it also includes both of Elias's publications in the back. So you get to compare both of them. And I'm very happy that NASA's looking into the anomalies like this. And related to that, of course, is the research by Wallace. Wallace has a patent, which for the audio track is number 3626605, method and apparatus for generating a secondary gravitational force field. This uses electromagnetics, and I feel it's very intriguing and also deserves more research. Along with that are a couple other patents. Schleicher's patent is number 5142861, which now, since I work at the Patent Office, I can give you a little plug. The Patent Office decided to finally let the public have access to the patents on the internet. And so you can actually go to uspto.gov, and you'll see that you can actually punch in the numbers and call up a particular patent. The search capability is also becoming available. I think it's this fall. So you can use a keyword to search for patents as well, which is about 1970. You can search back to around 1970. Now, Schleicher's patent that I'm referring to here uses a very large ampere, it's kiloamps of power, to produce an electromagnetic pulse behind the craft. He's demonstrated this on a tabletop pendulum, and that's right in the patent. He achieves a force of about 0.1 to 0.4 newtons with about 1,000 amps of peak propulsive power. And he speculates that 10 kiloamps will give him hundreds of pounds of thrust. It's based on a little-known relationship between the electromagnetic toroidal type of field, which supposedly has inertia. And that's the fascinating part about it. It's part of classical electrodynamics, and no one's explored this very much. The last inventor I found, which uses the same type of principle, is, I believe, Taylor, and his patent number is 5197279. And in 1993, he's the most recent one to propose a similar type of invention, producing a toroidal electromagnetic field outside and then pushing against it. Of course, he uses a lot of power. And in our present day and age, we think, oh, that's a real disadvantage. We can't generate power. We don't have any free energy. We'd have to carry all this stuff on board. Well, there are inventors, even in this room, who know how to make small modular power systems, and I believe we're going to see them coming to market very soon. In other words, free energy might actually be available, the ideal that I've been promoting for many years. This is a report from 1961 that was John Watson's bachelor degree report, actually for a Master's of Science, excuse me there, and it particularly identifies the gravitational control research, a summary of the literature that was known at the time when he did this work. And that's also available as a booklet that's been reproduced in the bookstore. Excuse me. Another important actually invention that I learned about in 1980 in Germany when I attended the Gravitational Field Conference that the late Dr. Nieper sponsored was the amazing invention of Rudolf Zinser. And he called it mechanical energy from gravitational anisotropy, MEGA for short. And What's interesting is that his force, which he calls kinetobaric force, specifically is related to the sawtooth oscillator, and I think the patent number is 4065364. And this signal generator specifically charges a container that is very small, hand-sized plexiglass container of water, and it has two zigzag electrodes. I got to examine this up close, and then a year later, Mr. Zinsser was invited and did attend the first non-conventional energy technology symposium in Toronto, and actually brought the entire apparatus. Now, this apparatus at the bottom is basically a balance beam. The transducer, which is the plexiglass bottle, is on the left side, and it's perfectly balanced so that a few dynes of force will actually cause the balance beam to move upwards. And what happens with this particular invention is that by charging the transducer over a short period of time, the effect is, as soon as it's turned off, there's a storage effect that maintains the force for a number of hours afterwards. And when you calculate the efficiency, it's greatly over unity, but the intriguing part is that the force decays over time, even with no energy being applied. So from my point of view, in the 1980s, I wanted to do everything I could to try to promote the invention. But the storage effect idea is so strange that there's no scientist that can understand how this is possible. And so, as far as I know, Mr. Zinsser really has not received any funding or any promotion of the research. But we did put together a complete booklet on his report, and that's also available in the bookstore. This is one of the data recordings of the force being applied. So anti-gravity in all of its different forms, which also this could be called a different branch of electrogravitics, is actually very fascinating. Now recently, anti-gravity also has received a lot of popular press, and that is in the article from Scientific American. Cosmological anti-gravity is now a household word. And you can actually talk about it freely without the criticism that various professors will decide to apply to it. Mainly because astronomers, 75% of the astronomers now agree that the only explanation of why the distant galaxies are accelerating away from each other is related to zero-point energy. The small fluctuations of energy that we have verified in laboratory are also present in distant space. And over a period of time, they do apply a small anti-gravity force. And basically, it's funny to see Scientific American call it a bizarre form of energy inherent in space itself. Because most people don't want to admit that zero-point energy is something real. This was the cover of the magazine.
What issue is that?
This was December 1998. And then Science magazine published an article in February of 1998, which is this one, Astronomers See a Cosmic Anti-Gravity Force at Work, talking about the same details, and I think 90% agree in this particular range that it explains the cosmological constant. In other words, Einstein was right when he proposed a cosmological constant, and nobody wanted to believe it. And so they're giving him credit finally, putting him on the cover of Science. This particular article was the January 1999 issue, as I remember, and they called it the breakthrough of the year. They've given this particular story credit as being the most important of the year. So that's the Association for Advancement of Science. And what we find when you review the literature is that one of the interesting connections to the process of anti-gravity and the force that might be applied relating to zero-point field is the fact that inertia is a zero-point field Lorentz force. And this has been published in Physical Review A, 1994, the February issue, by Bernard Heisch, Alfonso Ruda, and Hal Puthoff. And the important point and summary of this research is that inertia has been found to be an electromagnetic resistance arising from the little-known spectral distortion of the zero-point field in accelerated frames. the proposed concept also suggests a physically rigorous version of Mach's principle. And of course, anybody who's taken physics might remember that Mach's principle is the only explanation of the Newton's law that says if you're in one direction, you maintain that direction, and if you try to change, you're going to experience some force. There's no reference frame except the distant stars. Come in. And so this is exciting that Puthoff has finally related this to the Lorentz force. It's the fact that we're in electromagnetic field, we have electrostatic charges, and we're experiencing the Lorentz force and not really Newton's imitation of that. And this is one of Hal Puthoff's articles describing this discovery. This discovery has become important enough for Arthur C. Clarke to commemorate it in the book 3001. He basically looks back from the year 3001 and essentially gives credit to Puthoff and Hayes and Ruda for developing a scientific breakthrough that helped promote and invent the space propulsion. Well, in view of all of these discoveries I've just referred to, we see that Lockheed Martin is basically promoting the space plane as possibly the most far-fetched idea since the airplane. I don't think so. It's a nice improvement. It gets us over to the other side of the world pretty quick, but hey, my answer is that impotence is optional. The space plane can't get us to the moon so we can go bicycling on the weekend. The space plane can't get us to Mars where we can start building other colonies. And of course, did anyone ever tell NASA that there's stars and galaxies out there to go visit? Hey, we're basically impotent as a spacefaring society. And it's our decision whether to live in the cradle of civilization or else get out of the cradle, like Arthur C. Clarke says we're eventually going to do. And eventually the public is going to decide to start building anti-gravity devices in their garage, start taking off for weekend jaunts, and then maybe there'll be some breakthrough of Area 51 technology. And this is exactly what I want to refer to. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but I wanted to emphasize the fact that there's a secret air base in our country. It has no name. Even when you try to sue them in court, basically they don't admit that it exists, and that's how they dropped the court case. President Clinton actually assigned the EPA to go out there and investigate the environmental pollution problems. They did a complete study, classified the study though, can't read it. So there's a lot of secrets of Groom Lake going on, and the secrets are still secret, but every so often we do get people that come out and are willing to testify. And that's where one of our speakers at the Conference of Future Energy was, I think, very important. He's talking about free energy suppression. Dr. Stephen Greer knows dozens of Black Project technology scientists and engineers who have worked on these types of projects and are willing to testify to a congressional hearing. And it's up to the public, says Dr. Greer, to actually demand from their congressmen the release of this information for civilian applications. And the reason I'm saying this so confidently is that's what the Black World engineers are calling for. When you look at the Aviation Week and Space Technology issue of March 9th, 1992, besides the fact that the big headlines talk about the possible black aircraft seen flying around, which of course many of them are called UFOs sometimes, the smaller article below that specifically refers to the Black World engineers and scientists that are encouraging the using of highly classified technology for civilian applications. Aviation Week and Space Technology, March 9th, 1992. And we've had at least 2 congressmen who have also promoted this idea that classified technology has been held back from the public so long that we still are flying around and driving around in 1950s technology. For the past 50 years, our society hasn't advanced. I remember when I was a kid, I thought, gee, the year 2000, we should have levitating cars, we should be flying around in space. And what happened? Nothing. We're polluting our planet even more than we were back then, and of course we're reaching 5 billion people, which underdeveloped countries are going to start being the major contributors to pollution very soon. So I feel this technology is very important for our environment, if not even for our own freedom and sanity as we become overcrowded. Now, some of this information is also available in video form. This is only one of many different videos that seem to actually represent some factual information about the black projects. Recently, there have been some books on the same subjects. Stanton Friedman, who's a scientist and nuclear physicist that I've met a couple times now, has released a book talking about the Magic 12, the top secret 1950s panel that was dedicated to reverse engineering UFO technology. And here is the copy of Harry Truman's letter, which at the time was stamped top secret, eyes only, specifically appointing the Majestic 12 panel, which included some very prominent people at the time. And the more you look into this, you find that there's a lot of evidence to prove that, yes, we did have and we do have an extraterrestrial entities and technology recovery and disposal manual that's being used. And thanks to Dr. Bob Wood, this has actually now been totally photographed. It's reproduced in a typeset form, which is what I did to the Electrogravitics report. And of course, the front cover is included in the book. But then, of course, the book reviewers say, well, this doesn't really have credibility because we only see the front page. So now Bob Wood has made sure that they photograph every single page, and they're going to publish that so you can see the original. Another book which caused a lot of stir is Philip Corso's Day After Roswell. And for people that are in the know and actually interviewed survivors of the Roswell crash, hospital nurses, people that are still alive in Roswell, New Mexico, you find that something really did happen to cause the headlines of the Daily Record in Roswell to talk about a flying saucer being crashed and recovered. But of course, the military still to this day says that the Roswell case is closed and they're just weather balloons. So it's interesting that nowadays even Stanford University has emphasized the fact that the study of UFO-related phenomena is being urged. This is the front page of the Washington Post just in the past year. And this is a very prestigious study. 1997 actually was when they first did it, and then it finally received some press when it was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration. So since then, I feel it's important for us to acknowledge the fact that we're not really alone. Even Carl Sagan admitted that. There's craft flying around with advanced technology, and anti-gravity is part of that. So this is actually what caused me 20 years ago to get involved in the master's degree project that relied upon the UFO report that I read about in Norman Paulson's book. This is the first edition of the Homopolar Handbook, and the Homopolar Generator was described as the closest thing that Bruce De Palma could actually find to correspond to what Norman Paulson saw on his UFO experience, which this is an artist drawing, rendering of it. And this is the front ramp that you could walk down. It was a very huge ship, at least 100 feet, probably a couple hundred feet in diameter. And the report in the book was that the fact there were two disks the size of the ship. And if you think of something that's magnetized, which he described it as being magnetized, the size of 100 feet or 100 meters, you get into the stage where even if it's moving at a very relatively slow speed, like 1,000 RPMs, with conventional magnets, you end up with megavolt type voltage, which I feel is relating to electrostatic and electrogravitics. The story is that one disk caused the energy output, both disks rotating in opposite directions created this anti-gravity effect. And that was about all that we had to go on. I've met Norman Paulson, I've talked to him a few times. He's a very intriguing fellow. And this is some of the drawings from his book showing the force field being created and affecting the levitation of actually a truck underneath. And he had experiences, he claims, on the craft. Well, the reason I mention this is that besides the fact that I tried to look into some of the research relating to that, I also found what I believe is probably the best UFO book ever written, and that is from a technological viewpoint, Unconventional Flying Objects by Paul Hill, a scientific analysis, for the first time represents very technical information that we need as primitive engineers and 19th century, 20th century physicists that are trying to conceive of how a force field can be created. Well, Dr. Hal Puthoff, who did a review that you now have in your hands, says, to the degree that engineering characteristics of UFOs can be estimated by empirical observation, in this reviewer's opinion, the above referenced recently published book by Paul Hill provides the most reliable, concise summary of engineering type data available. And the important thing is that the author worked at NASA's Langley Research Center for years and actually had a few UFO sightings, offered to act as a clearinghouse for UFO-related data. And he found that the UFOs specifically had a directed acceleration field, a field that is, in general, a gravitational-like in nature, and particularly gravity canceling. And so let's review some of the details from this amazing book. The first thing we find is the description that the force field extends downward. That seems to be a very universal phenomena of these disc-shaped objects. And what he was excited about over the years of accumulating the evidence, both photographic and videotaped evidence, is that the force field is a unidirectional force field perpendicular to the plane of the craft. And the UFOs seem to tilt in order to travel forward or to brake. And even banking is part of their modus operandi. They were able to track the UFOs traveling at anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 miles per hour. They were able to make rapid course changes. And the landing data, which was taken specifically from the imprints left in the soil-bearing strength, the imprints and depressions revealed that on the average, the craft seemed to weigh around 30 tons. Had a density of about 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter, which even is the density of a submarine, which is a pretty dense object. So there's no need, he claims, to assume that UFOs reduce or cancel the gravitational mass. However, the the inertia has been analyzed to be electrogravitic effect, and the inertia is what is being manipulated within the craft. And specifically, the gravity shield surrounding the craft reduces the inertial mass to zero. Now, as I refer to this particular diagram where you see the banking effect, let me read one report from the book briefly. There was a sighting in 1951 in which they were launching one of the first skyhook balloons in Artesia, New Mexico. And after watching the balloon for about an hour, the group spotted a couple specks from the northwest horizon. And as they saw the two round, dull white objects flying in close formations, the objects headed right for the balloon. And so what was interesting is that they actually circled the balloon, they tipped on edge to create the steep banking maneuver, and the observers saw the objects were disc-shaped. Knowing the size of the balloon, they were able to estimate the size of the craft, which were about 60 feet in diameter. And since then, in 1952, there was a Navy chief photographer, Warrant Officer Delbert Newhouse, who specifically was able to grab his camera, his telephoto lens, and actually take his movie camera out of the car and record the actual traveling of a few craft, which actually darted in front of the camera several times. And apparently this recording was so momentous that they were able to show fighter pilots the videotape, or the movie tape, I should say, at that time. And the film was good evidence of the existence of saucers. They were able to describe the maneuvers and the fact that they banked to turn. And this is an important finding because it verifies the fact that we have a force that's being utilized for movement, for braking, and for levitation. It also has this characteristic that, in fact, let me read it exactly so you'll get the force field understanding. The force field pushes on everything in the field in proportion to the local field strength and in proportion to the material density of the substance being pushed. So that's what's interesting. If they're pushing against the air, they get a certain amount of force. If they're pushing against the earth, you get even more launching capability. This ice cream cone type of V-shaped um, force field below is specifically describing the visible ionization field. And that's what he uses to analyze some of the classical physics that's involved here. Now, what's interesting is many of the craft seem to show instantaneous turns, right angle turns, and so forth. Now, what he found is that if you can allow for the fact that 10 Gs are possible inside the craft, and they have some way of shielding the occupants from the forces that they're creating externally, it turns out with classical analysis, you can prove that in 9/10 of a second, you can go from 100 miles an hour in one direction to 100 miles an hour in the opposite direction. And that's not unusual. It's not violating any physics to do so. And the other interesting discovery is the chapter, it's actually appendix, on the UFO aerodynamics using incompressible flow theory. And what's interesting is that the analysis he does shows that these craft can fly at Mach 4 or Mach 5 in the atmosphere and not create a supersonic boom, specifically because they're able to create incompressible flow around the craft. And specifically, as air molecules come close to the field, it doesn't deposit any energy into the field. And there's also no wake that's created outside or in back of the craft. So it's simply silent supersonic flight. He tested the concepts with his own self-designed platform that used air pressure, so he could actually test the maneuverability of such a concept of a force field extended downward. The author is deceased, by the way, and this was only published due to his very persistent dedication of his daughter, who walked around with this manuscript for many years before finding the publisher. And this particular chapter, actually, this is also an appendix, analysis of the sound vibrations that are initiated, point out the fact that the force field itself seems to have a square wave type of operation. In fact, the hum that is heard from many of the close encounters of these craft, he feels is power plant connected. In fact, the data quite clearly shows that the force field cycles at the hum frequency. And its saucer also characteristically brightens just before and during takeoff. And therefore, the air ionization is due to an increase in the UFO radiation causing it, and these are all tied to the increase in the cycling rate of the power plant that is readied for its thrust. And it reaches a very high pitch when it finally does take off. So the data from that point of view, which has been repeated many times from observation, caused him to actually analyze the type of square wave that could be present. And he goes through some of this analysis in the book in more detail and finds that the field oscillates and so forth. So I'm excited about it. It's the first time we've had some technical information to go on and basically go on to perhaps reproducing some of this work on our own. Of course, we're talking about energy being equal to mass times the speed of light squared, and the question is whether we can travel faster than the speed of light. Well, that's a whole other area of research, and of course some of the anti-gravity warping drive, Albuquerque's warp drive, that does follow the gravitational general relativity Einstein equations, perhaps might allow us to get to the stars, but in the meantime, can we get to Mars? And of course, NASA's planning a manned mission to Mars. I've seen some of the television coverage, you might have as well. The important thing is it's supposed to take months to get there. But from a Life magazine article, we find that Mars itself can be terraformed and completely transformed into a livable atmosphere within only 100 years. And this I find very exciting. The first thing about Mars that's very amazing in terms of synchronicity is that the day is 23 and a half hours. I mean, what could be more convenient than going from 24-hour day to a 23 and a half hour day? The stages, there's 6 stages that Life magazine proposes, and that is to build plants even prior to men and women arriving on the planet, is to send different power plants there that will just simply emit the thermo type of gases. And these, in other words, create some pollution on Mars, let the atmosphere be created by just spewing out exhaust fumes. But of course, the exhaust fumes have to be breathable. And then as the atmosphere gets created, more and more heat will be retained, and therefore we can actually start seeing clouds, some water, livable atmosphere, and the greening of the red planet will start to finally occur within the 100-year span. And the interesting thing, too, is they propose that we can all have various wings that we can buy at the local store to go fly around, because there's about a third of the gravity there. So it'd be a lot easier to use your arms to actually travel from one space to the other. Get a little exercise in the meantime. So I propose that the anti-gravity research should continue so we can go onward to Mars. Thank you very much. And I think if you have any questions, how about if you see me afterwards, because I know that they're running short of time, so perhaps we can meet toward the hallway. Thank you. By the way, there is an article in this issue